Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk about clean data, clear insights. So I hope you're excited to hear from our experts today. And I'm going to turn it over because we have lots to cover.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Shaw-Sutherland. I am a senior project manager here at Just Tech. I'm going to be joining Susan and Rachel here kind of a little bit on the cuff. I'm going to run us through our agenda here and get us going. We'll do some quick introductions and then I'll let them kind of take off with that. Okay. Like I said, my name's Kelly Shaw-Sutherland. I have been doing some form of data or analysis or evaluation for roughly about the last 20 years. I was at Legal Aid of Nebraska before I came to Just Tech, and now I am using my skills to kind of project manage the crap out of everything, so it works for me. So you'll get some of that stuff too, depending on what the conversation is. I can jump in with some of that if it comes up. But for our actual agenda, we're going to talk about why good data matters. We're going to talk about what good data actually means. You need to kind of understand what data quality actually means in order to, I think, set yourself up for success. And that's something that Susan and Rachel are going to be talking a bit about. Also, how to improve your data quality and how to make the most of your data, how to make it useful. If at any time you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can, come off and ask your question if you want of chat. But we'll keep an eye on that and we will go from there. I am now going to turn it over to Susan, and she's going to introduce herself.
Well, thank you all for being here, and Rachel and the whole LSN team, but especially Shelly for putting this together. I am the managing attorney for data and innovation at the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. Previously, I've worked as the managing attorney for client intake, as well as on various other kind of admin and direct services roles within legal aid. So really happy to be here and talk about this topic that is very close to my job description, and a subject that I'm always very interested to talk with others about. But I'll hand it over to Rachel.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just a little bit about me. I've been doing data analysis work for over 26 years, the last 14 of which have been largely focused on legal aid organizations. In fact, I started out my career in this community on staff at the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland before starting my consulting practice, Strategic Data Analytics, over 11 years ago. And I've worked with legal aid organizations all around the country, doing all kinds of data analysis work, including comparisons of internal case management data with external data sources, looking at unmet need with particular focus on disparities by race and location. I've helped organizations develop outcome measures, create dashboards, and all kinds of other analysis reports, improve reporting to funders, evaluating projects, and training legal aid staff to increase their internal data analysis capacity, and most relevant today, helped organizations improve data collection and data quality.
Okay. Hey, we're going to start off with one quick poll real quick. So you're going to see it come up. We're going to give you a second just to answer that, and this should give us a good idea of who's in our audience today. And then we'll move on to why good data matters. Give me 1 second here. Looks like most of you are data specialist grants related staff. Looks like we've got about close to 70% of the folks on the call, so that's great. So highly relevant to you all. I'm just going to move to the next screen for you.
Okay. So since...
No, go ahead.
I'll wait for that. Okay. Well, since I guess most in the audience work with data, much of this will probably, you probably know a lot of what I'm about to talk about, but I think it's worth acknowledging the difficulties that some of us face collecting data. And we're collecting a lot in legal services organizations. We're collecting data about clients and cases and volunteers and services provided and clinics and a whole bunch of additional things. And sometimes what we're trying to collect can be confusing for those we're asking. Clients sometimes are confused about how we're asking questions, and sometimes we're confused about how to even ask in the first place. And I know for you and your staff, it can feel just enormously burdensome. But one of the advantages of having higher quality data is that it can help relieve some of the burden of that data collection. We can make it easier to collect and easier then to use, to understand and use. So bad data can cause misunderstanding clients' needs. It can lead to offering ineffective and improperly targeted services, because with bad data, we aren't really sure what's needed, and it's harder to see what's effective. Confusion and inefficiencies can arise from bad data, both for ourselves and for our clients. It can lead to erroneous reporting to funders because we're not fully confident about what services we're even providing, who we're even serving, and certainly not confident about what impact we're having. And bad data can cause us to get stuck in the weeds, tripped up by the data that doesn't make sense. On the flip side, good data can help us understand our clients' needs, because we can see exactly who it is we're serving and what their needs are, and have a better understanding of burgeoning needs in detail. We can assess and improve our effectiveness because we can have a better understanding of the services that we're providing and whether they're effective, and we can make informed adjustments if necessary. We can assess and improve efficiency because data about our work helps us be more efficient internally and in our provision of services to clients by highlighting inefficiencies. Good data allows us to define realistic strategic goals and measure progress towards them. And we can measure and describe impact, which is perhaps the most important strength of good data. It allows us to ask and answer whether we're having the impact we intend to have. With good data, we can impress funders by confidently reporting to them about the work we perform and the enormous impact we have on the lives of our clients and more broadly on our communities. We can target our outreach efforts, homing in on specific locations or specific vulnerable populations with the greatest need. Good data helps us see the big picture because we can aggregate it and analyze it. And finally, with good data, we can celebrate our successes.
I want to talk a little bit as well about what good data means. And so we've seen kind of from what Rachel was talking about, the huge impact that good data can have and how useful it can be. But I know that all of us have had conversations with folks, maybe senior leaders, maybe fundraisers or funders, who think that good data means a bigger number this year than last year, which can be good. That can indicate a good trend, but it needs to be representative of what's really happening. And so in this context, and for purposes of this conversation, when we say good data, we mean high quality data, not data that indicates something positive or desired. You want to know if something is going a way that you didn't intend. That's super important. And so the good data will tell you that, even if it's something that's, again, maybe you didn't want to happen. You can catch it, you can fix it, you know what's going on. And so my kind of proposed definition here for high quality or good data is data that accurately reflects and helpfully summarizes the complexity of the real world and clients' lived experience. And so when I think about this, I think about kind of taking a picture, right? So if I want to say I need some data about the local McDonald's, right? One thing that I can think about is photography, right? Like if I'm taking a picture, I'm getting data about that McDonald's. That's going to help me if I'm walking down the street to see it. I'm going to see the color, I'm going to see the context, I'm going to see where it is in relation to the street. But if I'm the plumber who needs to fix a plumbing problem at that McDonald's, that picture of the outside is not super useful, right? I might need a floor plan, I might need blueprints. And so the data that I need in the format that I need it in is very different. Maybe I'm the manager, right? And I need to know who's available to work at what times, right? That picture again of the outside is data, and it's accurate data. It accurately reflects the world, but it's not helpfully summarizing what I need to know, and it's not reflecting what I need to know for that decision. And so when we think about kind of data collection as taking a picture or providing kind of a a piece of information about something, we want to, again, hit both of these things. We want it to be accurate, accurately reflecting what's going on, and we want it to be the data that we need that helpfully summarizes the complexity of the real world and not just creates a bunch of noise that we don't know what to make of. And I did want to note here that we are going to be talking a lot about quantitative data, so numbers, but qualitative data and narratives are just as important. So think of this, right, as like, let's say it's the Yelp reviews of that McDonald's. You want to see that kind of number, that score, what people think about it, but you also want to see, you know, what are they thinking? Is it good quality? Is it bad quality? Did they have a good experience with the staff? Could they find parking? And so that qualitative data, that lived experience, really gives context and a lot more detail to the quantitative data that you can get. And so while that's not the focus of this conversation, I do want to highlight and kind of raise that up. That component of qualitative data of lived experience is just as important to understanding the data as the numbers that you collect.
I really appreciate that you wrote that it's the context of that it provides a lot of context for your quantitative, because that is just so true. I'm a proponent of mixed methods in my case. So let's see. There you go.
Yeah, so when we talk about wanting good data, again, with that context, that definition in mind, how do we get that? What does that look like in practice? And so the first thing that I would highlight really is just that it means asking meaningful or relevant questions, right? If I ask a client on the intake application, you know, what was your, what high school did you go to? Maybe that's information that I need, but most likely it's not. There are very few cases that would be relevant for someone's legal case. And it actually might not be relevant. Maybe they didn't go to high school, or maybe they went to high school in a different country, or it was called something other than high school. And so that's a question that might get us data, but it's not really meaningful or relevant to a lot of the services we provide. Similarly, we want to ask our questions in a way that is most likely to get accurate and consistent responses. And this really gets into starting to think about how you design these questions and shape these questions. And so I'll hand it over to Rachel to talk through an example of that.
Yeah, so I'm going to explain the example that's depicted there with the frowny face and smiley face. And it's a little bit of a complex example, but I think it really illustrates what we're talking about here, and really illustrates how important it is to think about how you structure new fields before you add them to your database and have your staff start collecting data. So if we focus first on the red box with the frowny face, there are 3 outcome measures listed there. Well, or they were described as outcome measures. I'll explain to you why not all of them were, in fact. So the first one, number 8, is clients' healthcare. Oh, and let me just also further explain that these are related. These were some outcomes that this particular organization is collecting related to their expungement work. So this is just a few questions. There are, of course, a lot of other questions related to their expungement work. So the first one, number 8, client's healthcare waiver application was granted. That's fine. That's a reasonable outcome for which staff can easily answer successful, unsuccessful, or not applicable based on whether the healthcare waiver was an issue in the case, whether it was granted or not. But it's number 9 and number 10 still in that red box where things fell apart. So number 9 reads, client's healthcare waiver was denied for statutory reasons, and number 10 reads, client's healthcare waiver was denied for discretionary reasons. So neither 9 nor 10 are actually outcome questions. They are really subsets of number 8. And what they really get at is if number 8 was unsuccessful, the healthcare waiver was not granted, 9 and 10 get at why it wasn't granted. So the way they're structured there as 3 separate outcomes, how are staff supposed to answer those? If the waiver was denied, should they answer successful, meaning that, so I've even getting myself confused and trying to explain it. So if the waiver was denied, should they answer successful, for number 9 and 10, successful for the healthcare waiver being successfully denied. It's too much. It's asking staff to answer positively for a negative result. And it was too confusing. It led to inconsistencies in how staff were answering the question. The data was unreliable. It was really unusable. It was just bad data, and created a lot of frustration. So now if we look at the green boxes, so in the green boxes, number 8 remains. We're still asking whether the healthcare waiver was denied, and that can still be answered successful, unsuccessful, or not applicable. But the only time those subsets pop up, which are now sort of an 8A, is if that outcome measure is answered unsuccessful. If it's unsuccessful and we're curious about why it was unsuccessful, then pops up this sub question that allows the staff member to say, okay, it was denied for statutory or discretionary reasons. So I hope that is a complex example, but I hope it shows how it wasn't really thought through when it was implemented. And then when we stepped back and restructured it, it became much more clear to staff. It's now being answered consistently. We now can use the data in an analysis and reporting.
Can I ask you a question, Rachel,
Yeah.
or kind of elaborate a little bit? So we had a similar, when I was at Legal Aid of Nebraska, we had sort of similar situations come up when we worked with you to create outcome measures. And so one of the things that I see with the red box is that not only the examples that you talked about, but it's more likely that they could choose like successful or unsuccessful for all 3 of those metrics. And that would lead to part of what the confusion is. So part of what I think you're talking about too is kind of that logic, right? To get to those nuanced, if you think about it like branch logic or like a survey where you might like ask a question and depending on what that answer is, it'll give you those. I think that that is super important, but also, and I know that this is a thing, I think for a lot of, well, I won't hit on it. I mean, like attorneys like to bifurcate a lot of things in ways. It could be this, it could be this, could be this. This is the way, I think, the appropriate way you would want to do it, basically. The most helpful way, I guess.
And I'll just add that there would have been a very, very easy way to avoid this. And that is to ask 1 or 2 staff people to look at, to say, here's how we're thinking about setting it up. Does this make sense? Or had this organization asked me, I wouldn't have let them set it up this way. But barring that, it's just really easy to ask a colleague or 2, does this make sense? Does this confuse you? No rocket science in that, just getting some assistance before implementing something.
So important. I have run into too many issues where I didn't have the chance to do something like that. And then it crashed and failed. So it's important to ask.
Yeah, and I think that kind of going back to the prior slide, you know, when we talk about putting these questions in this logical order and only asking questions that's relevant, that also increases that efficiency of folks being able to fill out the questions, right? They're not even getting presented with what is 9 and 10 in the red box if the waiver application was successful or if it was not applicable, right? And so you're actually speeding up that time that folks can enter their data, and that's gonna win you points. folks don't like spending lots of time on these things, and we don't want them to. We want them to spend time on doing the work that is kind of human to human and that requires their full engagement. Similarly, we want to make sure that, you know, these questions are asked at the right time. So if you're asking outcomes questions during intake, obviously you're not going to know. And so we want to be really thoughtful about where we're asking these questions and when. We want to make sure that the data that we're entering is appropriately reviewed and validated, so that we know that, again, those responses that we're getting, the data that we're getting is useful. And then once we have it collected, we want to make it accessible to the people who can use it. And we'll be touching on each of these in more detail as we go. But this is kind of, again, the framework that I personally use to define what good data is, and kind of as my own checklist as I'm building things out, to make sure that I've covered all of the bases that I need to get from intent to actual implementation.
You want me to go to the next one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Gotcha.
All right, so to understand your data quality, I suggest that you start by taking stock of what you're currently collecting. You could go so far as to create an inventory of the data you gather. I mean, that would be ideal. That's often pretty big ask, but that certainly would be ideal. But barring that, or in addition to that, one of the first things to do, and this is connected to what Susan was just talking about, is to identify where, when, and by whom specific fields are collected and entered. Looking for challenges that the structure, the data collection structure that you've set up has created. For example, are intake workers being asked excuse me, to collect details too early in the process, or are case handlers being asked to gather information too late in the process? And the very best method I have found to get the most comprehensive understanding of your data is walking through your intake process with someone who does intake. And I mean screen by screen, variable by variable, have an intake specialist or whatever your intake staff are called, show you the variables that they enter, pointing out the ones that are hard to enter, hard to understand, what's confusing, ask them why it's confusing, what they ignore, and why. And often it's because they don't understand what they're supposed to answer. What annoys them because it's redundant, because they've been asked to enter it, multiple times in multiple different spots. And then I would suggest talking to the staff who run reports. So that often is folks who have to do reports to funders, but there are other reasons for reports, of course, and have them identify the fields that yield really unreliable data or hard to analyze data, the stuff that makes them pull their hair out when they're trying to answer specific funder questions, and ask them if there's data that they have to export and then clean up outside of the case management system, because they just don't trust the data. Asking these people what's causing challenges for them will help you focus in on where the issues are. And then finally asking case handlers who close cases for the same kind of input. So those pie charts illustrate the kind of sort of an example of poorly set up data, and that arose before I even got my hands on this particular organization's data. It arose when I was talking to the people who have to input and use the data. So I kind of knew what to expect. So that left pie chart shows all the answer options for this one organization that are available in their close reason field. So, the list, the drop-down list that's available to them for the close reason, and there are many of them. And about 40% of what they're allowed to pick from are actually close reasons. 37% of their options are outcomes. 15% of what they're selecting again in their close reason drop down are rejection reasons. And then 8% I couldn't even categorize. They're sort of all over the place. So in addition to the way that organization has their close reason field set up, asking about more than one unique thing, asking about level of service, rejection reason, impact, outcome of the case, there's just way too many options. So what would a staff person pick if they wanted to capture both the level of service and the impact? Well, they can't. They have to pick with the current structure. Whereas the pie chart on the right shows the results for a different organization where the close reason is limited to just actual close reasons. And then the final point I wanted to make is that if there are fields that you need to know about that you aren't able to collect, that you just aren't collecting in your case management system, that you're tracking or your colleagues are tracking outside of your case management system, that should be your highest priority. You need to bring as much of your data collection into the case management system as possible. It's just, for all sorts of obvious reasons, it's difficult to combine data when it's collected in a case management system and outside, and to combine it in such a way that assigns it to the appropriate case or client. If it's being collected in an Excel field, file, we all know that fields with formulas can get overwritten, and there's a whole bunch of problems that can come about. So that would be, I think, probably the highest priority, is for getting as many fields as you can collected inside your case management system.
and I want to note on this as well. It's a lot of this, when I've seen things like this, organizations that I've worked for, it's because someone who is not a tech person, does not understand the database, is trying to just add one more data point in the simplest way they know how. But the simplest way they know how is just adding an option to a dropdown or collecting it in a different system that they feel more comfortable with. And so there's almost never any malice in these things, but the intent doesn't match the impact again, right? We see someone trying to, oh, we just need to add one more drop down, one more option, but in practice that actually becomes really complex and cumbersome, and it makes your data useless, right? So you're saying I need to track this, but then you're not actually getting the data that you need out of that. And so that's why all of you and your positions are so important, and why we hope to continue, sharing things like this with senior leadership and with non-data folks, so that they can see, how important the collaboration with you is to get the information they need.
One thing I would add, just from what they have shown you here, this is a really good way for, if you are wearing that hat and you're having a hard time like articulating to your leadership or your staff that why this is like a bad example. If you do run a report or something that shows like all the data that you're collecting, you can see visually like where the issues might be. And so that might be a way that will help you kind of get from point A to point B around what they're talking about specifically. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think kind of moving on to the next slide, that's one of the things that we definitely encourage, is when you're trying to find those kind of problem children in your data, right? Going through with the intake staff, going through with the legal staff, going through with the folks who are doing the reports, can really be helpful to kind of identify on the front end where there are problems. But this actually allows you to kind of identify that more on the back end once you have the data. Start trying to create visualizations and see where you're not able to get what you want, see where the things don't make sense. Start asking basic questions of the data and see if you can answer it. Another tool that's in your toolbox to kind of identify where there are opportunities for improvement is to make use of summary statistics. And so this is something that's very common in the data exploration stage. And if you Google that, it's not just legal aid to do that. Anyone that works with data has an initial kind of data exploration stage before they start making sense of a particular data set. And so you can do things like saying how many unique responses are in this field. So how many different options are there? If it's a text field that anyone can type in whatever they want, there may be hundreds or thousands or more of unique responses. If it's a multi-select, again, we're going to talk about those in a little bit later. We may have very, very many different unique responses, and it can be easy. It can be difficult to make sense of those. You could have a list of all unique responses and the number of each. So that can help you identify where an option is not being selected or might be over-selected. If you have choice A, B, C, and D, and you have 100 of choice A, 500 of choice B, 2 of choice C, and 0 of choice D, maybe choice D shouldn't be on there, or maybe people are misunderstanding it. And so it gives you really good insight. Similarly, how many times are folks skipping a question? If it's not required, how many times are folks just not answering it or putting, again, text field, putting in NA or typing in none? And so that actually gives you, again, kind of that insight onto where the data is and isn't being entered. If it's a number field, you can also use tools like averages and outliers. So if someone, this is another one that legal aids have a lot. So income data, percentages of poverty. If someone ends up in a household of 50, that's probably inaccurate based on most of our household definitions. If someone ends up, with $1 million income, again, it's likely that's a typo, but you want to look into it and see what's going on there. And then again, your averages can kind of tell you, are you generally getting what you expect? Or is there something potentially going on that you want to investigate?
These are great examples.
So I'm going to show a couple of examples of error checking reports that are run outside of the case management system. Susan's going to follow up and show you some run directly within the case management system, but I'm going to show you a couple now that are run on data downloaded from a case management system, but run outside, allowing for testing of multiple issues at once. So the the reports I'm talking about are run monthly, and that would be the schedule I would recommend for running error checking reports, but quarterly is okay. I think monthly is better though, because the cases are still fresh in everyone's mind. But the most important point about these is that the staff person who made the mistake needs to be the one to make the correction. It just doesn't work if a manager is always the one making the corrections, because then the staff person doesn't learn. And like Susan said, this isn't, 10 times out of 10, this is not someone being a jerk. This is just someone not understanding. But if we don't ever teach them what they're doing incorrectly, they're going to just continue to make those mistakes. So that's probably the most important point. So that larger report on the screen flags missing and or contradictory entries within closed and remaining open cases. Contradictions like a close reason entered without a close date, or various eligibility contradictions. This particular organization is an LSC funded organization, and so there are several eligibility fields that have to be checked in concert with each other. And those blue numbers on the report are hyperlinks to the case. So when the staff person gets the report, they can see where the X's are for the mistakes. They can read below the descriptions of how to correct the mistakes, click on the link, go in right away and make those changes. The snippet at the bottom, sort of that with the, yeah, exactly. Thanks, Kelly. Is a little snippet from a report that flags outliers, something Susan referred to. And this is specifically outliers of financial outcomes. And so what it's designed to pull up is financial outcomes that are more than 2 times the average financial outcome for cases with that particular legal problem over the past 12 months. Now, those cases may not be erroneous. Those may be high financial outcomes that were legitimately earned, but it could be, like Susan referred to, it could be a scenario where an extra 0 was entered, or something along those lines. And so that's the reason for having this outlier report to just verify. And then if we go to the next page, it's a similar kind of report, a little bit simpler. I'm looking for missing demographic information. And this one is run against accepted intakes, whether they are closed or remaining open, likewise reviewed monthly, likewise reviewed by the person who collected the information and therefore made the mistake. So usually that's the intake specialist. And this one's a bit simpler. It's flagging missing data that we know we need for various purposes. Likewise has hyperlinks to the cases, solutions described, such that staff can connect right to the cases and enter the missing information quickly. So just a couple examples of running this kind of error reporting outside of the case management system, and I'll turn it over to Susan to talk about some run within a case management system.
Do you need to take over the screen, Susan?
I will in a minute if you just want to go to the next slide for now. We started talking about, data cleanup as soon as we had a case management system. And we had reports that were run and sent to all of the management team. But for Legal Server, we didn't have really any way to kind of design our own reports, to build them, or to kind of filter them down. And so we had these huge error reports that were getting sent out to the entire management team every month. And the very predictable outcome happened that no one read them and no one fixed them and nothing happened. And so when we moved over to Legal Server, we, like Rachel said, hey, we have a lot more opportunity here to have more discrete reports that focus on something fixable. And we can target that to at least the specific team, and hopefully to the specific person that needs to make those changes. And so we actually pulled those all into Legal Server. We have a naming convention for them here, and that allows us to quickly find what we're looking for. But we found that even with this, this was a little bit difficult for folks to do. Again, folks had data overload, kind of report overload, and sometimes would just get behind because it's a lot to go through. And so if you want to go to the next slide, we actually took these reports, and we created kind of a helper document for year-end review specifically. So they always have those reports. We have a monthly review, kind of preferred for a lot of them. But at the end of the year, we needed more information, right? Legal server reports don't have instructions necessarily that come with them. You can do a lot like Rachel did and kind of put some instructions in the header themselves of how to fix problems, but we wanted to provide even more context. And so we have this Excel sheet that we used to help the management team be more structured in how they were going through these reports and what they were using them for. But even with this, again, it still requires everyone to go through, to click on the link, to add their filters, to do the review, and then if it's helpful for them, to come back and update that review status here. And so the kind of last iteration of how we've been doing this, if you want to go to the next slide, is really kind of pulling this all into to Power BI. And so I actually will, Rachel, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and pull my screen up. There we go. And so you can kind of see here a couple of things that we've done in our legal server. And so one is that all of those supervision reports that we had tagged as manager homepage, we've actually pulled those onto the manager homepage. And so you can put lists of reports, not just in the reports tab, but anywhere else that you'd like. And so we've pulled them here onto the front page for all of our managers so that they have what they're expected to look at right in front of them every time they log in. And then again, kind of highlighting that Power BI visual that we have, the case cleanup. The reason that we pulled it into here is because it makes it a little bit easier to filter. And so we can choose, do we want to filter by program, supervisor, or primary advocate? And then pick our program that we want to look at. And that stays sticky. And so I don't know if you can see the different tabs that are down here, but we've got multiple different reports, kind of visualizations that we wanted to show. And so those filters will stay across the assignment mismatch report, the outcomes report, close date before open dates, lots of things that we want folks to review and clean up. And then again, it has the instructions right there in line and the link to correct things that need to be corrected. And so none of these approaches, the kind of outside of legal server reports, the inside of legal server reports, the combo or the Power BI is better necessarily than the other, but each of them have features that may be useful for. So for this one, it's really easy for our supervisors to go in and say, okay, I'm going to pick a specific person that I'm meeting with. I'm going to go through all these real quick, and I'm going to make sure that that person is taking care of everything they need to. Likewise, they can see patterns by looking at their entire program or just the folks that report to them. But this is not totally real time. And so if you are doing kind of batch updates and you want to see those real time corrections, then going straight to legal server reports can be a better option. But again, regardless of your skill set, where your organization is at, what tools you're most comfortable with, these are just different examples of ways to get at that same thing, of having some way to see where that kind of, again, incorrect, contradictory, or missing data is, and being able to fix it as close to real time as possible.
Back. We go to the next screen, right?
Yeah, thank you.
There you go. Or did it go? No, it didn't. There you go. Sorry.
I think. Yes,
Did
that's
you
right.
get it? Is
Yes,
it on
thank
there?
you. It's on. You're good. Yeah, so I wanted to kind of highlight a little bit here as well, as far as, the reports we've been talking about are all catching errors after the fact, and data validation is an opportunity for you to prevent those errors from being entered in the first place. And so one thing that you can do to help, again, prevent errors from being entered is to be strategic in when and whether fields are required. So if you, again, let's say you have a question at intake of whether someone has experienced domestic violence or intimate partner abuse. That may be something that is appropriate to be required at intake because you need it for reporting. But it also might be something that folks are not comfortable disclosing to someone they don't have a relationship with or haven't had a conversation beyond just a few minutes. And so it may also be something that you want to require later. Or it might be something, if it's not something that you have to collect for everyone, maybe don't require to put a decline to state option at that very beginning, and then look at it again later on once you have that rapport. Similarly with the example that Rachel shared of having questions that don't apply, don't do that. If you can ever hide something that's not applicable, do that rather than have folks have to guess whether they need the answer, and if so, what the best wrong answer is. That's just not a scenario that's good for anyone. You can limit choices presented to user to only show fields or options when relevant, again, like that same example, or hide options that would introduce contradictions. And so I shouldn't be able to say, yes, I have employment income, but my employment income is 0, right? That's very rarely going to be accurate. And so you would want to have some kind of flag to say, you may be employed, but you don't have employment income. And so you can't have zeros there. Similarly, if there's something that can be automatically looked up or calculated rather than being manually entered, please do that. I think almost all of us at this point have some way of automatically calculating a percentage of poverty. If you don't, then you're going to have to rely on your staff to reference something or to look up something. And that's always introducing an opportunity for error because humans are humans. Similarly, there's tools to calculate, the area median income. There are ways to validate addresses and make sure that they actually exist and are not just, a random combination of numbers and street names. These are really great tools to, again, get those data errors prevent them from being happening rather than having to clean them up later on. And again, we know that real-time validation isn't always feasible, but the sooner you can flag it, the sooner it's going to get fixed, and the sooner you can rely on the data. There are emerging tools, I know, at least within Legal Server, to do things like workflows where you can automatically throw flags if certain conditions are met on a case. And so the whole goal, right, is to move that checkpoint as soon as possible after that data is entered as possible, if it's not something that we can control, keep from being entered in the first place.
Okay, so I have 11 tips for improving your data quality that are specifically focused on field design. And so I'm just going to run through those 11. So first of all, minimize your use of checkboxes. I mean, in fact, I would say it more emphatically, change checkboxes, except maybe in the rare instance where you're trying to indicate if a procedural step was followed or not. But really just tell yourself we're not using checkboxes. Change them to drop downs or buttons that require a yes, no, or not applicable, because blank checkboxes cannot be analyzed. It's impossible to know if a blank checkbox meant no or not applicable, or if a field was just skipped. So we really shouldn't be using those anymore. Remove default answers. I'm surprised that I'm even still seeing this, but sometimes I am. Do not have default answers because it will guaranteed skew your data. Whatever that default answer will be whatever that default answer is, will be over-reported in your data. Number 3, opt for single select over multi-select whenever possible. And Kelly, I think if you click, a little visual is going to pop up.
Oh, okay, hold on. Oh, there we go.
And Susan, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So this is a question on LAPLA's current intake. I think it may not last into the next year, but we've asked it for a long time of what health insurance our folks have, and it's required. And so this is something that we have to answer. But you can see that it's a multi-select. And so folks can select any one of these or multiple, including no insurance and other, or all of these, which would be absolutely nightmarish. But you can see the reason it's multi-select is because you could have private insurance and medical, or private insurance and VA medical care. And so the intent of putting that multi-select there was to get as accurate data as possible. But if you go ahead and click once more, what this results in is a summarization that looks like this. And so we can see we've got some declined estates / unknown and Medi-Cal and Medicare somehow. And so if I was to look at this list and say how many folks have Medi-Cal, I would have to do a lot more work to figure that summary out. I also would have to go through and say, why do you have one person that has both no insurance and private insurance? There's a lot of data in here that is just wrong, and then a lot more that's either confusing or hard to parse. And so we don't typically run summary statistics on this field, which is why we haven't bothered to change it. It really is on a case-by-case level that we need it. But you can see this is what happens with multi-selects, even with the best of intentions. And so make sure that you don't have multiple options that would be contradictory if you are going to use them. And if you can think of another way to get the data that's not a multi-select, do that instead.
Yeah, you're just asking for a lot of data cleaning, which I have had to do, which is not fun. So.
And by the way, if you don't aggregate the data entered in that field, you can end up with multiple rows per case, which can be confusing if you don't know that that's happening. So just an aside, an additional reason to avoid multi-selects. All right, so number 4, and I referred to this in some other examples previously, but fields must capture information about one thing only. So don't collect outcome and rejection reason within a close reason field, like I showed you before. Don't collect close reasons in the legal problem field. Don't collect rejection reasons in an outcome field. And those 3 examples I just meant you are actual, real legal services organization examples I've seen in case management systems. So again, we really want to be capturing one piece of information in one field and separating into 2 fields if we need to capture something separate. Number 5, and related answer options must be distinct and unique so that there isn't any confusion for staff when they're trying to pick among the options based on different circumstances. Number 6, hide and deactivate old fields and old answer options so that you're not getting new data using those outdated options. But really important to make sure that you don't delete the options or the fields because you will lose historic data. And Kelly, if you can click, I think Susan has a visual to show an example.
Oh gosh. This one right here.
Yeah, I think that might be yours, Rachel, but
Oh,
we've done very similar things of putting DNU or do not use. And guess what? People stop reading after the first word, especially if none of the other options seem applicable, and that's the one that seems the best. Folks are going to pick it. If it's there, they're going to select it.
Thank you for describing that example, Susan. I had a note to turn it over to you right there. So thank you. Super. Number 7, minimize the use of text fields. We've said this, unsearchable, impossible to analyze. So we need to avoid them. Now, wait, this one I think does have a visual that Susan's going to talk about.
there we go. There we go.
I think this one might be yours as well. The first one is mine, but you can see here the statistic that Rachel's pulled from this one that, if it's a text entry option that is a kind of other, please describe, you're going to get some consistency, especially if there's particular protocols or habits from the folks who are using it. But you can see that a lot of this is not really getting at what you want. So 72% is getting at a description of the other outcome. But then that 28% is generic and not really useful. And so making sure that folks know how to fill things out. If you are asking them for, again, typed out or kind of spelled out information, then the more context you can give, the better.
Can I just say one thing about open-ended other boxes? Because no matter how clear you are, you could write very specifically what somebody is supposed to do with another box, and you're inevitably going to get some or a ton of them that might input an option that you already had in your list, which is super fun as well. So I'm just saying, try to be as clear as possible. It doesn't mitigate it as much as you might want it, or just try to avoid them like they're suggesting. So.
Let's see, number 8, review the field location. So if a field is buried on a screen, excuse me, or located in a position on the screen that creates confusion. That's the kind of thing that I think you'll figure out if you do what I suggested a while back, in terms of talking to like your intake specialists and case handlers about where they run into confusion with fields. And an example that with an organization that I work with, they had the field asking about whether there was domestic violence involved in the case sort of buried on, I can't at the moment remember which screen, but it was buried at the bottom of a screen that really wasn't relevant. And that field was just almost entirely skipped until we moved it and into another spot that, made sense, that had similar kinds of questions asking about what types of things were involved in the case or what types of conditions the client was facing. Number 9, clarify whose responsibility it is to enter the data in the field, the intake specialist or the case handler. If you don't have it clarified, you'll end up with a lot of blank data. Number 10, evaluating new fields before adding them. So do you really need the new field, or might you be collecting the information elsewhere? I see this all the time when an organization gets a new grant. A whole bunch of new fields are created, maybe put on a separate tab for that particular funder, that are already being collected elsewhere. And so I just cannot urge you strongly enough, before you create a whole bunch of additional fields, figure out if you're already collecting that information, because I would say in most instances, you're already collecting most of what most funders need. I know there are going to be some specific funders that have very specific fields, but much of what they're asking you is stuff you're already collecting in the case management system, and you do not need to ask staff to collect it again. That means it's having to be collected twice. And then what do you do if on one screen it's entered one way and then on the funder screen it's entered a different way? So that's an important one. And then finally, number 11, and of course there are many more, but these are just sort of the top 11, is to create data entry procedures. That sounds like a lot of fun, I know, but it's really important, and to regularly train staff. It really should be done at least annually, because of the number of fields you all have, your complicated eligibility requirements that change over time. And so these things just need to be revisited, and staff need to be informed. What often happens is that you're trained when you first arrive at an organization, and then you're never trained again. And so that also leads to inconsistency, because the people who started working 30 years ago understand data or a particular field and how it's supposed to be answered potentially very differently from someone who was hired in the last year. And so you need to do that regular updating and regular training to get everyone on the same page for consistency's sake.
In the same vein of improving your data quality, like what Rachel was saying, you need to have these conversations as someone who knows your data, as someone who is familiar with what is collected and where and by whom. You need to be in the room when data collection or use needs are being discussed. And if you're not that person, if you're a manager, or you're someone who maybe doesn't know the database and the back end of it as well, seek out those folks as you are getting new data reporting needs, data collection needs, etc. Because there may be options that you don't know or hadn't thought of to get the data in the format that you need it, in the way that you need it, and to have a strategic thought partner in where that should be asked and how. With Rachel's example, right, we have many grants that need very similar data, but they have required slightly different ways of phrasing it. And so for data folks, so long as it's a one-to-one matchup, changing that title of, perhaps you collect something as a race as Black, and someone else connects it as African American, and someone else puts a dash, and someone else puts a hyphen. Those are pretty easy things to to fix in post, if you will, and to kind of change the way that it's labeled without changing the data input. And you might not realize that that's an option, or that that's relatively easy. Similarly, you might say, hey, I need this new field for a grant. Let's put it on intake. But if that grant is 2% of your work, do you need to ask it for the 98% of folks who don't need that data entered? Yeah, and maybe yes, but most likely it's no. And there may be another place that you can collect that information. And so similarly, if you are that data person and you have this insight on, hey, we're collecting this piece of information twice, or we're getting these errors, or it doesn't seem like folks are understanding this question, the folks you work with who aren't in the weeds of this might not know what they don't know. And so they might also recognize the problem, but not realize that there are solutions. They don't know about branch logic or guided navigation if you're in legal server. They don't know about potentially, tools within Excel to do pivot tables or other options to summarize data. And so if you notice that things don't seem to be working as well as they could or should be, offer alternatives, give examples, and invite that conversation. It may not solve everything overnight, but at least you're not stuck in a position where there's a problem that everyone sees and a few folks might have ideas about how to fix, but it just goes on for a long time because that conversation was never initiated.
I think that's a super great point. I mean, communication about this stuff I can't even stress it enough. Just be willing to have the hard conversation. I know it stinks, but it's the best case scenario.
And I'll just mention sort of further back up for the point, that example I showed where that outcome was structured with 3 separate outcomes and really shouldn't have been. That data were collected in that structure for about 4 months. And as those of you who do expungement work know, maybe it was long, maybe it was 5 months. There tend to be a lot of expungement cases. And so the data correction that had to happen afterwards was extraordinary. And it was so time consuming. It took up so much time for the staff to have to go in and make corrections. And had a 5-minute conversation been had before that was structured, we would have avoided that. Okay, so I want to urge you to consider conducting a sort of inventory of your reports and creating a report catalog. But rest assured, I don't mean, like a binder that sits on someone's desk. What I really mean is a report catalog within your case management system. I really mean sort of an organized structure of your reports. And depending on the case management system, they may be structured slightly differently. But I can't tell you how many legal aids I work with where I go to look at their reports and there's just one long list of reports with a whole bunch of confusing names. Really hard for me to figure out which reports I need to use, certainly hard for staff who don't work with data all the time to figure out which report they should be running when they need to answer a question or respond to a funder request or what it is. So what I'm really talking about here is organizing reports into categorical tabs or in lists that are well organized depending on your case management system, and having a naming convention that everybody in the organization, at least those who have the ability to create reports, are well aware of, with very clear titles that make it clear exactly what's within the report. And just one final note on that. There should not be, and this is part of what would happen if you took an inventory, there should not be multiple copies of reports that do the same thing but have different names. And this can be the absolute hardest thing to get on top of when you've gone through years of unbridled report creation. But the sooner you can get on top of it, the better, because what will happen is that there could be reports with slightly different names that have slightly different filters, and a person opening it might not notice that in this particular instance, I don't know, a particular legal problem code was filtered out. And so they think they're reporting out on all the data, but they didn't notice that there was a filter in. So just another reason to get these reports as well organized and as well named as possible. And Susan, did you want to comment on the
Yeah, sure. So I think, we mentioned up earlier, and I showed the example of kind of how we've pulled our reports for managers, the most common ones, onto the homepage. Again, the intent behind that was to put those reports where they're going to be needed, where they're going to be seen. Similarly, if you do have like an Excel sheet that folks are going through, you can link to reports. They have unique links, and so you can always put a link where folks need it. We do some grant tracking outside of Legal Server, and so again, putting the links directly to the reports that folks need to run in line with how to run them can be really, really useful. You want ultimately for folks to be regularly referencing these reports because the more often someone uses something, the more fluent in it they're going to become, more familiar, and so the more consistent their analysis of it is going to be, and the less likely, again, that we're going to end up with a filter that got left over or something else that causes the data to be incorrect or confusing. Another thing that you can do to, again, help build that fluency is to do something like a report spotlight at meetings. And so we have some reports that we have built for our advocates to run. So they're not for managers or grants funders primarily. They're primarily for individual staffers to understand their own caseload. And so this is something that we do roadshows about. So we'll go around to different work groups, case review meetings, and say, hey, by the way, this is what this report does, and here's how you can find it. Similarly with managers, if there's things that we see that there's common requests for data that come through to myself or to the IT team, or there's common needs that are identified either by us or by the management team, we'll have some time in a management meeting to say, hey, here's how you can find this information for yourself. Here's how you can do it. And here's the support that you can expect from myself or the rest of the team to help make sure that it's what you need. And that's also a really great opportunity to highlight the support that you can bring. So one thing that I like to mention in those meetings is if there's something that you would really want to see on this report that would be really helpful that's not here, let me know. We've seen sometimes where folks don't know that's something they can ask, and so they'll be running our existing reports and they'll be missing one field, and they end up having to search for each case and then click through multiple options to get that one more piece of information. Whereas, that would take me 2 minutes to add, and then it would save several hours. And so again, building not just the fluency and the literacy with the reports themselves, but with the data that underlies it all, and with what you as a data specialist or someone who's more familiar with these things can do to help them is really essential. Right, and so this really is teeing up kind of the next bit of this training series. So we really wanted to focus today on data management and kind of thinking through what your data is and how it can be better. But one of the things that you can do with data once you've gotten it into this place where it's you know what it is and what it communicates is to put it in visualizations to help share that with others. And so visualization puts data into context and or formats that our brains can more readily understand. So perhaps your brain may not say, okay, 50% looks like this, and then 5% looks like, oh, how much is 5% and 50% different? I don't know. Once you start talking about numbers, our brains are very bad about really understanding what those mean. And so putting something into visuals can be really helpful. It can also be helpful to see things that may be more complicated to just look at in numbers. So trends over time, for example, if that's in a line graph, it might be much easier to read quickly than if you have just a list of 200 numbers and try to see the patterns in that. It can also show the relationships between various data points. Again, looking at something over time can be really interesting, or being able to slice by race or by office or by work group to see, is someone's satisfaction level higher based on their intake method? If they came to us online, are they getting better service than if they came to us in person, or vice versa? Some best practices, again, this is going to be the whole subject of a lot more training, but just 2 really quick tips. One, keep it simple. Visualization, the whole point is to pull complex information into something that folks can understand in a glance. And so it's interesting to have all those slices. If you're a data person, you love it. But less is often more in visualization. And again, in that same vein, tell one story per page. And so if you're wanting to highlight the kind of impact of, let's say, opening a new intake channel or opening a new office and seeing what the increase in services might be. That's your only story for that page. Don't also then try to say, okay, well, how did that change our geographic layout, or how did that change our work group distribution? Different pages, you can tell different stories, but try to tell one story per page when you're putting these things together. And again, that will help folks to be able to see and immediately understand that big picture. And then hopefully, the more that you do this and the more that you have that data conversations, you'll get those follow-up questions of, well, how does this impact it, or how does this come in? And that's where you can, transition from having the really difficult conversations about really need to get this correct and accurate at the beginning, to having the more interesting ones about, well, what do we do with this now, and what further questions might we need to ask to be able to make informed decisions. So Kelly, I think I might toss it back to you at this point to talk about some of the other programming we've been working on.
Yeah, I've got a couple of things, but I wanna just say one last thing based on what you were talking about. Now, I originally came, up in an academic environment, and one of the things that you constantly have to, I guess, keep yourself from doing is, when you think about what you're talking about with data and what you're presenting, Susan's so right. Like, focus on what you're trying to explain about a particular visualization one at a time. You will have the opportunity to weave that story or stories together once you get through all of them, but you can confuse things so much if you try to do too much with one. And so I guess it's all about being patient a little bit. You'll get to it, but you just kind of have to do it in a way that makes sense at the end of the day, I guess. So the thing that I wanted to bring up for everyone is, in addition to the great discussion that we've had here today, Just Tech has been working with LSNTAP in a collaborative effort to put together a series of video. It's like a video toolkit, different parts, and it relates and supplements this particular discussion very much. It's focused on why data matters, and kind of walks you through it using a fictional scenario. But it takes you through it using, this might be good for the person who might be a new user to that was asked about in the chat, to go through this series, because it really takes them down to, like, you get somebody who starts to do data analysis in this community, and maybe they've done data analysis in other spaces. There's still a lot to learn when you come into the community to begin with, because there's just a lot of nuance, a lot of complexity, and a lot of just stuff. And I can say that having come into the community in that way. And I think the more that you can focus them in a situation where they can learn from a very basic scenario, which is what the toolkit sets you up for. They're like 5 to 10 minute short video snippets that will kind of take you through it. And those will be posted very soon to the LSNTAP website. So if you have questions or anything about that, you can absolutely ask Shelley or reach out in any way for that. But yeah, so I think that takes us to any questions that anybody has on here. We've gotten some in the chat, but. There were questions about like good sources for like doing beginning things, like learning how to do pivot tables and things like that. I suggested LinkedIn Learning because I had a lot of folks at Legal Aid of Nebraska do it through there, and it seemed to help them. But there's also places like Shelley suggested. There's Udemy. There's other courses that are online that are free. You don't necessarily have to do it for a certificate or anything like that. You can just take the one off. There's like lots of YouTube videos that shows you how to do like certain things too. Yeah.
Kelly, I'll just mention that likewise on the LSNTAP site, we'll be launching a tool that was actually launched several years ago, but we're in the midst of updating it right now. And we've renamed it the Data Analysis Tool for All, which is DATA for short. And that includes a series of 25 sort of very typical legal aid related kinds of data questions that organizations might have, and then walks through very detailed steps about how to get the data you need to answer those questions, whether that be from within your case management system or externally available data or a combination of the two, and shows you how you can answer that data question in pretty easily. And it's really designed for beginners or folks new to the community. I mean, I do think there are some examples that even those with lots of experience could benefit from taking a look at, but it's also designed to be really easy to follow for someone new to this kind of analysis. And I'm updating the contents, having worked in this, doing data analysis for so many legal aid organizations over the last 14 years. So I'm using real legal aid data, probably probably without naming the organization. But it will, rest assured, it will be real legal aid data being used in all of those examples. So watch for that too.
And we're hoping
Yeah.
in the next year that we're going to bring up, get more into the data visualization side of things. So this is kind of a first effort in a series that we're hoping to do. So just hang in there, and we'll get to the fun kind of stuff that people like to talk about. I didn't mean to cut off, Susan. Go ahead.
Oh, no, you're totally good. I was just going to kind of branch off a little bit on the training piece, if there's no other kind of different questions of, one of the things that I found when talking about bringing folks up to speed with data and data analysis is that there is no substitute or better way to get someone familiar with how data works than giving them a data problem to solve. So give them a data set and say, hey, how many of this thing are in this category, or we need to translate this report to this format. And obviously give folks the resources, give them the trainings, but have them figure it out. And then if you have the skills in-house to sit down and go through with them and say, okay, how did you solve this? What did you do? And then think through, are there any other better tools that might make this more efficient in the future? That's where you really start kind of getting an understanding of how things fit together and what data is and what you can do with it. Is by solving problems. It's not by sitting behind the screen and going through all the kind of dry trainings by themselves. It's kind of going back and forth between trying to solve a problem, realizing you need a better tool, going and learning the tool, solving that problem, realizing you have another one, and then going and learning a new tool. And so it's always that back and forth. And to the extent that you can support folks in having that journey, then you're going to get, again, much deeper understanding than if you just give folks, here are the 5 steps for this report, and they don't necessarily know why or what it's doing or where that's coming from.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, one thing that I will also say, kind of in conjunction with everything that you both have been saying, is when I started at Legal Aid of Nebraska years ago, I was kind of like, oh, let's do everything all at once. I was like doing all of these mistakes that you all are talking about. I was just like, yes, let's do it. But I think one big thing that I really took away from coming from an outside entity, working with organizations, kind of like what Rachel's doing now and what I might be doing to some degree now, working as that outside person with those internal, it's so important to have somebody that you don't have to be the necessarily the person who has the expertise, but knows enough to be able to talk with somebody on the outside, right? So like, I'm not a database architect. I'm not like somebody that does all this stuff with, whatever, not a data scientist, whatever, but I have enough experience that I can have those conversations with people who do, so that it doesn't get confused. So if you have the opportunity to at least just get yourself informed enough about putting yourself in the conversation a little bit sooner, you might mitigate some of the issues that Susan and Rachel brought up, maybe a little bit sooner. I'm not saying it's a fail safe, but I do think that it is helpful. All right. Well, if that is it, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap it up. We'll get the recording out. Shelly will let you all know when it's out there. And don't forget, you can join Susan's monthly data series. I think if it's not in the chat, we can get the information out to you. We'll get that shared with you, and then we'll go from there. Thank you so much for joining us this month before the holidays, and hope everybody has a safe and stay warm and everything. So, yeah.